Hey guys, and welcome to part 4 of the Octophant Photoshop tutorial. If you made it through the last video, you will now have an almost complete Octophant. In this video, we will complete our final 8th tentacle by blending it into the trunk. Let's begin by duplicating the elephant head layer and rasterizing it, ready for puppet warping. I'm going to keep the original smart object for now, although I'll most likely delete it soon. Select the rasterized head and under Edit, Transform, select Puppet Warp. As with the pen tool, I won't go into detail how it works here. It's a truly brilliant tool and there are lots of great in-depth tutorials on YouTube. Essentially, our goal here is to add some pins dotted along the trunk and then click and drag these to bend the trunk around into a rough curve. Take your time and tweak each point a little at a time until you're happy with the result. Once you're satisfied with how it looks, we need to duplicate one of the existing tentacles and blend it with the trunk. This is probably the trickiest part of the whole tutorial, so don't be afraid to take your time and have a couple of goes at it if you're not happy with the first. I'm going to use the first tentacle we did as I like the shape, and the way it tapers off at the end will work well, helping it look like it is part of the overall trunk. First, let's duplicate it by holding Option and clicking and dragging the layer into our elephant group. Now let's use Scale, Rotate and vertically flip it to get it into roughly the correct position. This is now about right, so let's use Puppet Warp on the tentacle in the same way we did on the trunk earlier to pull parts of the top of the tentacle around to help it stretch to roughly match the geometry of the trunk. Now it's time to blend the tentacle into the trunk. Add a layer mask onto our newly warped tentacle and in a similar way to how we did the previous tentacles, use a soft round brush at full black to gradually paint on the mask to fade off the edges. It's fine to tweak the position of the tentacle and paint away the edges like I do here to help it match the curve of the trunk. If you overdo it with the black brush, hit D to ensure your two main colours are either black or white, and if needed hit X to flip them over so you have a solid white brush to paint back in areas you'd like back in. Keep repeating this process of painting on the mask with both black and white to remove or show the areas of the tentacle until you are happy with the overall blend. Zoom in closely on the suction pads to go around these carefully with a slightly harder brush. Once you are happy with the result, let's do some additional blending by double-clicking the tentacle to open the Layer Style panel and using Option-click, drag the Blend If Grey underlying layer dark tone slider in to blend in some of the darker areas of the elephant's trunk with our tentacle. I'd actually like to increase this effect a bit more, but have some control over the areas where it appears, as I don't want the effect on the whole tentacle. So let's duplicate the tentacle, reset the Blend If Grey, and put this into a new group. Add a solid black layer mask onto the group to initially hide everything inside it by holding Option and clicking Add Layer Mask. Then paint with a soft white brush areas where you want to reveal this non-Blend If Grey layer, thereby obscuring the underlying Blend If Grey affected layer. Mostly this is on the suction pads. I put it into a new group with its own mask rather than painting directly in its own layer mask to keep the original tentacle layer mask intact and make adjustments more easily. Lastly, I want to darken the entire tentacle so it matches the darkness of the trunk more closely. You could also lighten the trunk as an alternative, but since this is the main tentacle, I want it to stand out a bit more from the others later on. Let's create a new group called Trunk Tentacle, containing our tentacle layer and our group we just made, and add a Curves adjustment layer above this. Now you'd think you'd be able to just clip this to the Trunk Tentacle group, but if you do this, we actually lose all the Blend If Grey adjustments we did earlier. Instead, we can get around this by command-clicking the different tentacle parts to create a selection of just the opaque pixels of the tentacle. We can then use this selection to create a layer mask on the Curves adjustment layer, effectively mimicking how it would be if we had clipped it to the group, but keeping our Blend If Grey adjustments intact. Drag the top right control on the Curves graph to about halfway down to reduce the brightness so its levels are similar to the trunk. We can then bring back some highlights by painting on the Curves adjustment layer mask with a soft black brush with a low flow over areas where we want it to be less dark. Let's also open the Layer Styles window of the Curves adjustment layer And this time, let's option click the highlight slider for the underlying layer in the blend if grey controls to bring in some of the tentacle highlights through the curves adjustment. This just makes some of the lighter parts of the suction pad stand out, which will help with everything looking more detailed later on. Our last job is to just tidy up the areas of the curve mask where it has bled over the outer edge of the tentacle, where I missed removing the tentacle selection I made earlier, so we have a nice clean finish. Okay, I like how this is looking now. Before we wrap up this video, let's just do a quick puppet warp on the tentacle immediately to the left of the main trunk. Since this will be underwater later on, I want to give it a slightly more curvy shape, as if it is being affected by the water movement. Okay, that about completes it for this video. We now have all 8 tentacles, so we can move on to the blending stages.